I'm gonna go ahead and throw a wrench into both of these deals, and that's that at the end of 30 years, I'm gonna say the property value is half of what it is versus day one. As a real estate investor, I'm constantly thinking about debt and this whole idea of what an appropriate down payment would be, especially given the many loan options out there, especially here in the US, where you can bring as little as 5, 3.5%, or even 0% down to a deal where you're not even coming out of pocket for the down payment. So it's all debt. And there are certainly risks with that, which we'll get into, but I do want to talk about this whole idea of bringing less down to a deal because I think it's a lot more powerful than you might realize. So let's set up an example here. We'll start with the same property. The only thing we're going to be changing on either side is the financing. So here's your house, and we'll draw the same house twice because we're doing two examples here. So same house in either event. We'll say that this house is $100,000. So 100K. It's a little small, I apologize. Maybe we can zoom in. So we have the same $100,000 property in both cases. So on this side, the left side, we're gonna be doing 5% down. So we're only bringing $5,000 as a down payment for this $100,000 property. So that's 5% down. And on this side, we'll do the more traditional 20% down, where you're bringing 20% down to the property. And that's typically what a lot of lenders are going to be requiring, at least for investment property. Typically, you can only get this 5% down or 3.5% down financing when you're using owner-occupied loans. That's the loan I have for this property I'm filming from right now. I brought 5% down to the table because I'm an owner-occupant, and after my first year of living in it, I can then move out of it and rent it out. So in that way, you can kind of use this owner-occupied financing to your advantage. It's not as though you always have to live in the property. Of course, check your loan terms. But these are the two examples we'll be looking at. I could have brought 20% down to this property, even with the owner-occupied financing. But anyways, we have the 5% down property and the 20% down property. They're the same property with different financing. And in this case, we'll assume both loans are very similar in their other terms. There are 30 years, fixed rate financing. So your typical subsidized US mortgage loan. So you're getting really great terms, whether you do 5% down or 20% down. There's some pretty amazing loan terms thanks to all the subsidies. The point is the financing is very cheap because, well, lenders effectively get a lot of help. So for this property, that would mean you have to bring $5,000 in a down payment, whereas with this one, you'd have to bring 20% down. So that would be $20,000 on the $100,000 property. And I'm not including closing costs here. That would effectively be the same for either property or pretty close to it. The loan fee might change a bit, but in general, I'm just trying to keep this example simple, looking specifically at your down payment, though you probably would have other expenses to bring here. And also you're finding a $100,000 property, which every market doesn't have, of course. So many markets in the Midwest do, though who knows what the quality of that house is. Any event, we're going to use $5,000 as sort of your initial investment for the 5% down property and $20,000 for the 20% down property. Makes sense. And for this 5% down property, you have a bigger loan payment. Obviously, the loan is bigger. You're looking at a $95,000 mortgage versus an $80,000 mortgage. So your payment is going to be bigger. So for the 5% down property, we'll actually assume that you are break even every single month after you pay towards your reserves, assuming you're renting this out as a rental after you move out or something like that. So in this case, we'll say $0 in cash flow, and I'm gonna project this over 30 years. So over 30 years, you have zero cash flow. It just broke even. You're making your payment every month, so you're still meeting all your expenses and everything. I'm not saying you don't put anything into the property, but in this case, your tenant, the rent coming off the property is being used to pay for all the expenses, but you get 0% cash flow. Whereas with the 20% down property, we'll say that you're making around $1,000 per year in cash flow, which you're not getting with this 5% down property. So we'll say that $1,000 times 30 years would equal $30,000 in cash flow. I'm gonna go ahead and throw a wrench into both of these deals, and that's that at the end of 30 years, I'm gonna say the property value is half of what it is versus day one. So instead of being worth $100,000 at the end of 30 years, once the loan is paid off, it's instead gonna be worth $50,000. So that would mean once the loan is paid off, you're left with a $50,000 property value versus the 100K that you actually started with. So in that case, the real estate market went down 50% by the time you reached the end of 30 years, which maybe it'll happen. Maybe you're nervous about the real estate market and you don't like where it's going and you think it's gonna be going down. Well, stay tuned. In this case, I'm saying it does go down quite a bit, and this is over 30 years, so it never recovers from where you started from. And we'll say the same for the other example as well. This is down to $50,000, so that's the equity you're left with. So I'll go ahead and write equity so that's clear. My board writing isn't all that great. Still kind of new to this. Okay, great. So you have your $0 in cash flow over 30 years for the 5% down property. You have your $50,000 in equity, Whereas with the 20% down property, we're looking at $30,000 in cumulative cash flow plus $50,000 in equity. Now, I will just note that you could be reinvesting this cash flow as you go, but I'm not going to be counting that here, just again to keep the example pretty simple. So again, the property value fell in half in both cases, and you ended up paying off your mortgage by the end using the rent from the property. So you're not adding any additional capital into the deal. So now we're left with the $50,000 property, no debt, and then any cumulative cash flow that you've saved up. So that would mean that your total return, just in dollar terms, for the 5% down property would be the $50,000 in equity that you have, the $50,000 return. Whereas with the 20% downside, we're looking at the $30,000 in cash flow plus the $50,000 in equity, which would mean your total return would be $80,000 over the 30 years. But now we have to compare this to our initial investment, because you can't just go ahead and say, oh, this deal was better, because remember, you put more down at the beginning. You put $20,000 down, and that was your initial investment. So when we compare the $80,000 return over the $20,000 investment, you 4x'd your money. So that would mean that you had a 400% return over those 30 years. So not bad. You 4x'd your money, even though the property fell in half. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Now this works out to something like a 4.7 to 4.8% compounded annual growth rate over the 30 years. I checked that beforehand. I did not do that in my head. So we'll go ahead and write down the 4.7% CAGR. Okay, great. Now let's compare this to the 5% down property, because remember, you have the $50,000 in equity, didn't have any cash flow to add to that, but you only put $5,000 down, the 5% initial investment. So we'll go ahead and put the $5,000 initial investment right here, which would mean that you 10x your money over the 30 years. So that is a 1,000% return over those 30 years, which effectively comes out to nearly an 8% compounded annual growth rate. And again, this is if the property value fell in half during those 30 years and never recovered. So that ends up being that 8% CAGR. And another big thing to keep in mind with this example is, remember, you only put the $5,000 down here versus 4 times that with the $20,000 down for the other deal. So you could have done 4 of these deals in the same amount of money that it took to do 1 of these deals with the 20% down. And that's where you can really start to scale your returns in real estate, when you have multiple sorts of these deals versus just being able to do less with more down or with more cash into the deal. But when I was walking through this example, it just didn't seem right that even though the property fell in half, you would think that being more leveraged would actually compound those negative returns, and that it works on both ends. If the property goes up in value, the leverage is helping you on the way up more, but it would also be hurting you more on the way down. But in this case, it actually insulates you in a weird way, because you put so little down up front versus the other deal. And even in the case where the property fell in half, you still came out positive. You 10x your money, came out positive on the other one too, because you're still pretty leveraged with 80% financing. So it's not as though that's not leveraged at all by any means, but compared to the 95% leverage with the only 5% down, you ended up with more than double the effective rate of return here when you 10x your money versus 4xing your money. But of course, this comes with a very big caveat, and that's the fact that you need to meet your loan payments in either case, but your loan payment is bigger here in the 5% down case. So you have more to worry about during the process. That's why it's very important that you get a deal that can handle the amount of debt you're giving it, because there's no guarantee that rents will continue to grow. And if you're cash flow negative on day one, you're going to have to bring more money to the deal to try and weather any potential storms, because you don't have that sort of cash flow cushion. So you have less room for error in that case, because you need to make sure that the rent that comes in can actually pay for your debt. And that's the big risk with any amount of debt. You're taking on an obligation, so you have to meet that obligation. And if you don't, you're going to feel a world of pain. And that's not just on the deal side. You're going to lose the deal potentially. You're going to definitely wreck your credit, and it's going to make it harder to get other deals, and it's just not going to be very fun. So I am not suggesting that using the lowest down payment is always the best option. It often is, and it often can be, again, if you play your cards right and you make sure you're doing things carefully, you have reserves going in, you make sure that the property can actually handle the amount of debt you're putting onto it. That's really what matters above all. But I think it's clear that when you use leverage in real estate, even on really a bad deal that falls half in value, you still end up with a decent investment. This is a really bad case. You're losing half the property value over a full 30 years. And at least on the 5% down case, you don't even have any cash flow to work with. So you still ended up with that 8% compounded annual growth rate in a really bad case. And that's, again, assuming that you actually were able to keep meeting those payments, you're replenishing your reserves, you're taking care of the property without having to put any other money in, which is definitely a detail that should not be overshadowed. Debt is a very powerful tool. And when you're wielding this powerful tool, you have to be very careful, because you can always set things off in a very bad bad way, and then you're trying to pick up the pieces after the fact if you didn't set yourself up properly, or you over leveraged yourself, which you never want to do. And there's always at least some risk when you take any amount of debt, because there is someone else that you are promising to pay, and if you don't meet that promise for whatever reason, you're going to be in trouble. But anyways, just wanted to share this example, this concept, because it shows how debt can really be used in a powerful way to scale your portfolio, and even in a bad case can actually be used to sort of insulate it in a very strange way. But in any event, tread carefully. But otherwise, if you like this video, I'd very much appreciate it if you hit that like button below, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future updates since I put out new videos every single week. But until next time, take care.